Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. Christ is risen, everybody.
Christ is risen.
Truly is risen.
So we have completed chapters 1 through 3. Now we're in the second half of the epistle. And there's a big shift now. The first half of the epistle of St. Paul to the Ephesians it really deals with the dogmatic aspects. And so there were a lot of teachings, if you recall, about the church, about unity in the church, what that means. And now we get into the moral teachings. That's the second half of the epistle. But you'll see that St. Paul, and he's very good at doing this, he'll take the themes that he's already given and he'll build upon them. And he's going to talk about them now from a different perspective, from a moral perspective, or from a Christian living perspective. So before we actually read the chapter and get into the commentary, I wanted to make a couple notes just about what we've read so far. And really there's one main point that I want to cover. And it's this idea of being an ecclesial person. It's something we've talked a lot about the topic of unity. You notice that in the epistle to the Ephesians, St. Paul is constantly bringing up this idea of true unity in the spirit, and what that means. And you'll see that he's going to talk a lot about how we live out that unity and how we avoid divisions. So leading up to this, he said quite a bit about the church. You've heard me say a few times, this is really the epistle about the church. This is really the epistle that tells us most about what the nature of the church is. And the aim here is to become an ecclesial being. Ecclesial from ecclesia, which is the Greek word for church. So an ecclesial person, what does that mean? I was listening to a lecture by Father Joseph Copeland. If you go to Father Josiah's Patristic Nectar publications, he has 3 lectures on the spiritual life. I forget what it's called. Let me see if I can pull it up here while I talk. But he has 3 lectures, I think it's 3, from Father Joseph Copeland, who's a priest up in Washington State. Phenomenal priest, really, really good priest. It's called Divine Energy, Saving Transformation in Jesus Christ. And there's 4 lectures. And the 3rd lecture is called Transformation in the Church of Christ. It's phenomenal. I think it's behind a paywall, so you'd have to pay for it. It's well worth your time. I really highly recommend going to Patristic Nectar publications and finding the lectures by Father Joseph Copeland and listening to them. And the 3rd one, he makes this really beautiful point, and he says it better than this, but essentially what he says is, we tend to look at ourselves as people who live in the world and are members of the church. And he said, but the Orthodox Christian, if we have the proper mindset, it's that we are citizens of the church who are just sojourning as passerbys, passer-throughs on this earth. That's where our true identity is. That's where our true homeland is. The church is what defines us. We just happen to be on this earth for now, but this is temporary. We want to go on to the true world, the true universe in a sense that Christ created for us. We want to be in heaven. We want to be with Christ in that sense. And so that the church is where we begin this. This is where we really live, and this is how we live. This is what should define us. So it's a very different way. So if everyone could if you mute your mics, if you don't mind, there's no background noise, and as usual, you can type in any questions, or you can unmute yourself and then ask. But either way, this was one of the main points he had in that lecture, that we're mainly citizens of the church. And this is what St. Paul's getting at in Ephesians. He's talking about how true unity and even true personhood, and we're going to get into that today, true personhood comes from being a member of the church who constantly grows in Christ. It's really important that we understand this before we go on, because it gives us purpose. It's amazing to me how many people today live without purpose. We wonder why so many people are depressed and anxious and even suicidal. Suicides are just skyrocketing. Even before the coronavirus, they're skyrocketing, especially among youth. A lot of people live without any sense of purpose whatsoever. And the church gives us purpose. It means that if things are going well, or if things are going terribly, there's an aim towards which we're moving at all times. And you may have heard Father Justin or I talk about the three motivations for the spiritual life. We either want to avoid punishment in hell, or we want the expectation of reward in heaven. We have that great expectation, or we do things just out of pure love for Christ. Of course, the third is the ideal, but we're not all there yet. And that's why Christ uses all three. He uses the idea of punishment in hell, of expectation of reward, and of just being sons and daughters of a loving Father and loving God. And that's why we do the spiritual life. So the church gives us this sense of purpose no matter what's happened in our lives. And even when disaster befalls us, we don't despair, because we see in that disaster, in that crisis, we see that the hand of God can still work. I mentioned this right at the beginning of when Father Justin and I started doing these videos. I read this letter from St. Nikolai Velimirovich. And the letter is all about how we use the word crisis today, but in past times, they would have used the word judgment, which tells us a lot more about what we're enduring and what's happening. When terrible things happen in the world, we see judgment. We realize that sin is what causes us to depart from God. And when you depart from God, who is life, who is joy, who is peace, we lose life, joy, and peace. That's a natural result of us departing from God. And so when terrible things happen, either personally or on a grander scale, we look at that and we say, okay, this is a call to me. This should drive me to pray more, to fast more, to be more focused on Christ, because this isn't our true homeland anyway. And we can actually find a blessing through tragedy. Through the crucifixion comes the resurrection. Without that purpose, disaster is just disaster. And there's nothing we can gain out of it. So St. Paul is talking about the sense here that the church is our true homeland, and through that, we have an aim. Our entire life has an aim and a goal. And while some of that is actualized right away when we become members of the church, there's also a sense in which it's incomplete. One of the ways we put it all the time is at baptism, seeds of grace are planted, but we have to water those seeds, and then a garden grows out of that. So this is kind of the structure of the epistle, is that in the first 3 chapters, he's talking a lot about what those seeds are, what that does for us, what it looks like in the church. And then in the second half, he says, okay, here's how you water them. Here's how you water them. So with that, we'll do our typical, we'll do this in our typical manner. We will read all of chapter 4. And then we're going to go back and go section by section and offer commentary on it. And again, I'll do it in 2 different translations. I'll start off again with the CSB, and then we're going to go to the RSV, just so you can get a different sense of the verbiage and the translations. And again, translations matter. So chapter 4. Therefore I, the prisoner in the Lord, urge you to live worthy of the calling you have received, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope at your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all. Now the grace was given to each one of us according to the measure of Christ's gift. For it says, when he ascended on high, he took the captives captive. He gave gifts to people. But what does he ascended mean, except that he also descended to the lower parts of the earth? The one who descended is also the one who ascended far above all the heavens to fill all things. And he himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, equipping the saints for the work of ministry to build up the body of Christ, until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of God's Son, growing into maturity with a stature measured by Christ's fullness. Then we will no longer be little children, tossed by the waves and blown around by every wind of teaching, by human cunning with cleverness in the techniques of deceit. But speaking the truth in love, let us grow in every way into him who is the head, Christ. From him, the whole body, fitted and knit together by every supporting ligament, promotes the growth of the body for building up itself in love by the proper working of each individual part. Therefore I say this and testify in the Lord, You should no longer live as the Gentiles live, in the futility of their thoughts. They are darkened in their understanding, excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them and because of the hardness of their hearts. They became callous and gave themselves over to promiscuity by the practice of every kind of impurity with a desire for more and more. But that is not how you came to know Christ, assuming you heard about him and were taught by him, as the truth is in Jesus, to take off your former way of life, the old self that is corrupted by deceitful desires, to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to put on the new self, the one created according to God's likeness in righteousness and purity of the truth. Therefore, putting away lying, speak the truth, each one to his neighbor, because we are members of one another. Be angry and do not sin. Don't let the sun go down on your anger, and don't give the devil an opportunity. Let the thief no longer steal. Instead, he is to do honest work with his own hands, so that he has something to share with anyone in need. No foul language should come from your mouth, but only what is good for building up someone in need, so that it gives grace to those who hear. And don't grieve God's Holy Spirit. You were sealed by him for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness, anger, and wrath, shouting and slander be removed from you, along with all malice. And be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving one another, just as God also forgave you in Christ. Okay, so that's it's a beautiful chapter 4. Absolutely incredible. There's so much that we could talk about. So with my own notes here, I had to be rather general because we could talk about this chapter for weeks and weeks on end, as with any other chapter, but especially chapter 4. So we'll begin again with verse 1. I, therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all lowliness and meekness, with patience, forbearing one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. So we begin right away. St. Paul reminds them that he's a prisoner. That's fully in their minds. They already know that. So why mention that here? Well, because exactly what he's calling them to, he's letting them know that he's not being a hypocrite about this. He's a prisoner of the Lord. And so he begs them to be worthy of the calling to which they've been called, with all lowliness and meekness, patience, forbearing one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. If he can do this in chains, certainly they can do this in freedom. You notice that he says we need to be worthy of our calling. The underlying thought here is that the Christian life necessitates progress. It necessitates progress. This is really important for us to understand, because we believe so much today that if we were baptized into the Orthodox Church and we go to church on Sundays, we're Orthodox Christians. And what he's saying here is, well, no, it can't end there. That can't be all it means to be an Orthodox Christian. An Orthodox Christian isn't like having a membership card, and we simply pull it out every now and then and say, well, this is what I am. So many Orthodox Christians live their faith this way. Rather, we have to have the sense of progress within us all the time. We can never be remaining still. This is why you may have heard me say this before. I say this quite a bit. If we were asked, what's the passion that plagues you most right now, and what are you doing to combat it? If you can't answer those questions, there's a deep problem with our spiritual life. Every single one of us has one or two passions that especially plagues us. We ought to be able to identify that passion, and we ought to have a plan that we're actively working on to try to overcome that passion. Okay, so let's say we struggle with laziness. If laziness and sloth are the chief passions that plague our life, which means that we're going to go entertain ourselves or rest before we pray every single time, or even most of the time, even part of the time, then we have to say, okay, what am I going to do about this? How am I going to change my mindset? How am I going to change my life? What are the steps I'm going to take? And this is why we have a spiritual father, by the way, because he helps us work out that plan. But I will tell you, I know more parishioners than I'd like to admit from previous parishes and friends' parishes. Those thoughts never crossed their minds. One of my previous parishes, I would mention this sometimes, and I would have looks of almost offense. I was told, we've already become Orthodox Christians. Our job is to convert others, and we don't have to do any work on ourselves because we have it all set. That's a dangerous thought. Even the greatest saints, I've read accounts of some of the modern elders and their confessions. It doesn't get into the content of their confessions, but the people who confess them say they have never seen greater repentance and sorrow at grieving God. I mean, just tears running down their. These are the saints. These are the ones who had struggled and had essentially perfected the spiritual life. But the closer we get to God, the more we see every little speck of sin, and the more those things really sorrow us. I read a beautiful quote from Saint Paisios. I think it was yesterday, or the day before, and he says that if we have a coldness in the spiritual life and we don't have an eagerness to pray, he said, remind yourself of one thing. It's just one thing we have to remind ourselves of. Remind yourself how much you have that was given by God. You've heard me say this a lot. The only thing we have that we can call our own is our sin. It's the only thing that wasn't given to us. Our very bodies and souls, all of our energy, every gift we have was given by the grace of God. The only thing we have that we can claim for ourselves is our sin. And so he said, the one thing we need is gratitude. Be incredibly thankful to God for his love, for his mercy, and for all the gifts he's given us. And that will encourage you to pray. We need to do these things. We need to be engaged in the spiritual life and not live it mechanically. There's always a place that we're moving to and something we're moving away from. So you notice he lists three things in that progress. Lowliness. Okay? Lowliness, which is often translated, maybe more properly, humility. Humility. It's interesting. Humility was not seen as a virtue at the time of Christ and the apostles. Humility was actually looked down upon. Having pride. Now there was that sense of Roman dignity that was so prevalent. The idea of humility was kind of a weakness, and it was seen as kind of this sniveling, like feeling terrible about yourself. And Christianity really transformed it into a virtue and said, no, we look to the humility of God, who lowered himself and became a servant for our sakes. Servitude was not something that people would aspire to back then. And so Christianity really changed this. We need to seek humility, which is selflessness. It's not feeding the ego, but rather making ourselves small, crushing the ego, and becoming zeros before the face of somebody else. We want other people to be everything for us, and we want God to be everything for us. But that means that we have to be nothings. And that's not a depressing thought for us, because the more we make ourselves a zero, the more God can fill that empty space. Meekness. Meekness is an interesting term. Again, a lot of people look at that. Even today, people see meekness sometimes as in a very negative light. And again, they see it as kind of a weakness and I don't know how to quite describe it, but I mean, you can just imagine the connotations that come to your mind with the word meekness. It's kind of a uselessness almost in a sense. But meekness really means strength subdued. That's about self-control. It's about an outer weakness that we take on ourselves. We want to be weak so that God can be strong in us. And this is what St. Paul says. He says, if he's going to boast of anything, it's not of his gifts, it's of his weakness. Why boast of my weakness? Because again, that means the strength of Christ can dwell inside of me. There's a great story. I forget I think it's St. Paisios. Somebody came to him, having heard that he was this very holy figure. He said, oh, yeah, I've heard you had the power of God in you. And St. Paisios, of course, just dismissed it. Really liked that talk. He didn't want to become prideful. But the guy started bugging him, and he started shoving him. He goes, if you have the strength of God in you, let's see how strong you are. You look like a weak old man to me. He started pushing him and pushing him and pushing him, just shoving him over and over and just being an annoying jerk. And finally, St. Paisios had it, and he goes, all right, you want to see it? And he just barely taps the guy, and the guy flies back multiple feet and knocks into a tree. And when he came to, he got up with his look of fear and then just ran off as fast as he could. That's meekness. There was an inner strength that St. Paisios always had that was subdued. And Christ, of course, shows this most in his passion. He says, if I wanted, I could call upon my Father who would send legions of angels to save me. But he subdues his own strength to willingly go to the cross. And then patience. Patience it's more than just waiting. Patience is really this idea of, it's a peaceful long suffering in the face of persecution, in the face of attacks, hatred, in the face of suffering. There's a sense of long suffering quietly. And so this is really what the Christian is called to. This is why we don't get up in arms about every little thing. It doesn't mean that we don't speak up. We have to speak up in the face of unrighteousness. But when things hit us, we're not whiners. We don't complain, and we don't become bitter because of those things. So it's one of the things I mentioned in the video that I put out yesterday, and I think Father Josiah mentioned it in his video, which is where I got it from. This idea that even if there's a fight that we know we're going to lose, we do it anyway because we want to do the right thing. You want to do the right thing and move forward. And we don't sit there and become embittered because we're going to lose it. And you note, of course, that again, St. Paul wrote this while imprisoned. So an example of humility, meekness, and patience. That was him. He also uses this term in verse 3, eager to maintain the unity. Again, that implies an active life. It implies that unity is something we need to work towards and actively hold up. How do we do that? The best way to do that is to fight the passions within us, because that's what will create divisions. We can't really fight the passions in other people. They have to choose that. But we can fight the passions in ourselves. This is one of the biggest mistakes I see people do all the time. They're so eager and quick to judge what's wrong in the church, with the clergy, with other members, but they won't look at themselves. It's a great way to create more division. But when they just quietly say, this is what God gave me, and it's okay. I can utilize imperfect means to try to perfect this. If you do that, you can move properly towards the spiritual life. You can move forward properly and really create a positive unity.
I have a thought.
Sure.
If I may. You just reminded me of something that, I like to play the guitar a little bit. I don't play it as much as I used to, but when I was younger, I played it a lot. It was a hobby of mine. And sometimes my strings would break on my guitar. You're supposed to have 6, but sometimes I would only have 5 or 4 or something like this. And I would continue to play even though one of the strings was broken, because I liked to play and I didn't want to get a new string. And what I found was that I had to play it in slightly different ways.
Sure. Because
the string was broken. And so I would learn things about playing that I would never have learned if I had all the strings. So I think that relates to what you're saying about doing the Christian life, doing Christian things, even when circumstances are different from what we're used to and things seem kind of broken in a way.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that even more with the image he gives of the human body and how we all kind of play different roles in that, and what happens when one of the members isn't working properly. We kind of have to. We can look at that actually as an opportunity, but at the same time, we need to realize who we are and what we're doing in that sense. So we'll talk about that. So, okay, good. A couple more quick things. This idea, again, true unity is this theme that comes up again and again. A lot of people don't see the connection between two major events in the scriptures, one in the old and one in the new. And so I want to mention it. I think most of you probably know this already, but Pentecost. Why was it so important that people could hear things and speak in different languages? Why was it so important that the barrier of languages was broken down in a sense? It wasn't just so that the gospel could be preached everywhere. Of course, that is the reason. But what was that undoing? It was undoing the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel is where people sought unity, and they sought the pride of unity, false unity, creating this big tower that would reach up to the heavens without God, by the power of man alone. And so God scatters the peoples and gives them different languages, because when people get together, they become very prideful. We see that today with globalization, by the way. Technology has really done this to us, where we're becoming very prideful and we think that we've just mastered everything. And you see that idea of trying to break down barriers through technology, and people think this is true unity. But what happens? We get together and we fight. We're going to talk about that in a second too. So Pentecost undoes this. Why? Because it's not just a breaking down of language barriers, it's a unity of spirit. And again, that's a theme that you're going to see again and again and again. It's when the apostles were filled with the Holy Spirit that true unity was found, because true unity has to happen in God. It can't happen outside of God. Actually, I'll mention that example now instead of waiting for it. But an example of false unity. There's an interesting story told by Christina Hoff Sommers. If you don't know who she is, she's a professor and a scholar who studies feminism. She's a Democrat, but she cannot stand modern feminism. She thinks that what they call first and second wave feminism are great. Third wave feminism is ridiculous. She said she came to that conclusion because in the 1990s, she went to this big feminist convention and everyone got into separate groups and they were going to have these small group discussions. But something interesting happened. They're all there for the same reason. There should be a sense of unity. But what happened was people began talking, again, I talked about this in my video yesterday, people began bringing up their various grievances. And so one person said, yeah, we're all women, but I'm a woman and a minority, an ethnic minority. And so I'm actually a greater victim than you. And then someone would come along and say, well, yeah, but I'm gay. And so I'm an even greater victim than you. And suddenly within these groups, fights started breaking out, shouting matches, because everyone was trying to claim the highest or the lowest, I guess is probably the way we'd say it, the lowest rung of victimhood. And so the unity that was intended actually began to be broken. Then that's when Christina Hoff Sommers kind of looked at this and said, something isn't right about this. So the very purpose of why we're doing this is being broken because we're all kind of in this shouting match for who can be the greatest victim, and it's actually creating more division than unity. You see that today. One of the really interesting things is the feminist response to the transgender movement, because there's half of the feminist camp that says, you know, transgenders are also they're part of the victim culture and we need to support them, and there's another side that says, well, wait a minute, a man who says that he's a woman hasn't actually had to deal with the issues that we as women have had to deal with. You know, they don't have they go into everything, menstrual cycle. They don't go and they will never be pregnant. They never have to deal with you know, especially they're late transitioners. They never had to deal with job discrimination, pay discrimination, whether you believe in that stuff or not. So it's kind of an interesting thing where the unity that we're seeking actually creates more division. Fyodor Dostoevsky, he prophesied about this in his book, The Possessed or Demons, depending on how they translate the title, where he it's a book about this small group of revolutionaries who become the very things that they're fighting against. Exactly what happened with communism. It's exactly what happened with communism. In communism, what are you most terrified about? That the very party that you support eventually turns against you. That's why Solzhenitsyn said the most terrible sound under the communist regime was a knock at your door in the middle of the night, because that's when your whole world fell apart and you knew it was all over. They've come for me. Everything's going to be gone now. It's kind of interesting. The unifying force, if they find a supporter who doesn't support them in the right way, they're gone. Okay, let's go on to verse 4, verses 4 through 7. There is one body and one spirit, just as you were called to the one hope. Again, you know, one body, one spirit. Again, unity is the fact that there's one God and one spirit. Therefore, if we're all united to the same spirit, then we're united to one another. Just as you were called to the one hope that belongs to your call, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of us all, who is above all and through all and in all. By grace, but grace was given to each of us according to the measure of Christ's gift. Beautiful verses. St. Paul, just so interesting. He talks about how he's not a good speaker, but when he wrote, sometimes he wrote so poetically. It's really beautiful. So one Lord, one faith, one baptism. Okay, one Lord. There's a unity of God in God because there's only one God. And the one Lord has to reveal himself to us. So there's one revelation that he gives. He gives it in different measures to different people, but there is ultimately one revelation that's given. One faith, we're united in what we believe. And what we believe matters because it transforms both how we act and how we relate to God. So there's one faith in that sense. And then finally, one baptism, not just baptism itself, not just the holy mystery of baptism, but really one way of practicing the faith. Baptism is the entrance to the church, and so there's one life in the church. And so what he's saying is that there's one God, there's one doctrine, and there's one way of life. This is the unity that we find in the Spirit. Now, people try to break from that all the time, which is why we have so many divisions within Christianity. Really, it's divisions from proper, true, and full Christianity. So we take the partial truths and then we add our own things or subtract our own things, which is obviously dangerous and problematic. Who is above all and through all and in all. So what does he mean here? Above all, the Lord is over all. He's over the entire universe. He's the Lord of all creation. Through all, he works through all things. He can even work through our own departures from him, which is why we talked about how he can work through disasters and our sin to actually call us back to him. And in all, God dwells in all people. But you notice in all of this, is God the Lord of all? Does God work through all? Does God work in all? Only insofar as we allow him, because God is a respecter of free will. It's one of the amazing things to me. I'm sure you've noted this before, that we have a culture which says we need to get God out of public life. No prayer in schools, no Bible reading in schools. We need to get God out of public life. You can't even call it Christmas vacation anymore. It has to be winter break. You can say happy holidays, but not Merry Christmas. We certainly don't say Easter break anymore. We say spring break, even though everybody knows where this comes from. We have to get God out of public life. And then when a natural disaster happens, or when there's a terrorist attack, what do people say? Well, where's your God now? He left because you told him to. You're the ones who told him he wasn't allowed here. So you can't blame him every time something bad happens, because you're the one who didn't want him here in the first place. You can't have it both ways. So we have to make the reality of God present by making him present in our hearts first. However, St. Paul is quick to point out that this unity that he's calling us to in the Spirit, unity and spiritual equality, does not mean sameness. This is a big fallacy we see all over today. Big debates about this. That if men and women are equal and therefore they should be the same. No. You can have unity even within diversity and division. That's the proper way to look at things. So men and women are different. There should be no surprise about that. But some people are really surprised when they find out that no, actually men and women are different. I remember reading an article once by somebody who believed that the differences between men and women were just cultural constructs. And then they had children. They had boys and girls, and they tried to treat them exactly the same. And they went, oh my goodness, the girl is girly, and the boy is boy-y. He acts very in a very masculine way. He likes the certain boy toys. The girl likes the girl toys, even though we try to raise them in a genderless way. They discover that there's actually something innate within us. You can try to blame that on culture around you in society, but they figured out pretty quickly this happens really fast. They found that the differences in infants can be seen after just days. Literally, a boy or a girl can be just days old, and they find that there's already a difference between boys and girls. And they did this by they would hold certain toys in front of infants who were, again, just days or weeks old, and they found that the focus of the girls remained on more girly toys, and the focus of the boys on more boyish toys after just days. So anyway, in the church, this is the same idea. A priest isn't seen as above the people. The priest has a greater administrative and sacramental and spiritual role within the church. But like I told you before, when I go kiss icons, when you kiss icons, you don't take somebody like St. John of San Francisco and somehow kiss his icon more tenderly with more fervor than you would St. Julian of Lazarevo. Well, she was just a lay person. He was a bishop. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. There's a unity there, even despite the fact that they played very, very different roles within the church and within their own lives, within their own families, with their own people. And that doesn't matter to us. That doesn't matter. What matters is the true spiritual unity. That's really what we're looking for. So there can be differences, and there still can be equality and spiritual unity within that. Very important to understand that. And a lot of people today don't, which is why you see people complain quite a bit that there are no women priests, or I've had even guys complain that the clergy get more benefits in the church. They're allowed to do more. That's not the way we look at the church. We don't look at it in terms of the rights of grace. We just look at it in terms of a united purpose, and we each have different roles within that. You notice here, some people are given more grace than others. We've talked about this before too. Elder Ephraim of Kathanakia, who is right there. I know you can't see him too well. Saint Ephraim of Kathanakia now. I think he was one of these modern elders who wouldn't nurse on Wednesdays and Fridays. And people look at this, I know I've given this example before, but people look at this and say, how is that fair that he had the grace of God so present with him as an infant that he would fast? He would fast. Without understanding it, he would fast because the grace of God was so present in him. Well, that didn't happen to me, so he must have had more grace at the start than I did. Why is that fair? Well, Christ talks about this. He talks about how we're going to invest the talent given to us. And some people are given 1, some 5, some 10. And we want to double it. You can sit there and say that's not fair, but the ones who are given abundant grace at the start of their lives are usually the ones who have lives of even greater suffering. Elder Ephraim of Kathanakia is certainly one of those who suffered greatly in his life, way beyond what most of us could take. St. John the Baptist, who leapt in the womb of his mother. He had a graceful experience as a fetus. But his life was full of deprivation and suffering. So St. Paisios, once again, he explains this beautifully. He says this so well. He says, we all want to be filled with grace and with joy. He goes, but some people are buckets. They can hold quite a bit. Some people are just mugs. They can hold quite a bit less. And some people are mere thimbles. They can hold very little. But he says, but if you're filled, no matter what size you are, you feel filled. You're full. You're full of that joy and of that grace, and you feel fulfilled within that. Such a beautiful image. You may only be a thimble in the spiritual life. You may not be set for great spiritual experiences, great feats of asceticism, but you can still feel full of the joy of God with what he's giving you. And you can't really compare yourself to others because you don't know any better. If you feel full, you feel full. And that's just how it is. If you think of it in terms of eating, some people can eat, a plate with mounds of food before they feel full, and some people can eat just a few bites and they feel full. But both walk away from the table satisfied. Okay, let's go on to verse 8. Therefore, it is said, when he ascended on high, he led a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men. Just a really quick note on this. I wanted to read a couple paragraphs from Father Lawrence Farley's book. He had a couple nice things to say about this. He says, here St. Paul explains this with a verse from Psalm 68, verse 18. In its original context, this psalm was about Yahweh's victorious ascent of Mount Zion. As a king returned from battle in triumph and received plunder, gifts, from his captive enemies to distribute them in turn to his followers, so Yahweh's ark came in triumph to Mount Zion, where he was to receive tribute from his conquered foes. St. Paul applies this psalm as referring to Christ. The ascending in this messianic application refers not just to Yahweh's ascent of Zion, it refers ultimately to Christ's ascension into the heavens after his earthly struggles, wherein he captured captivity and conquered death for our sakes. The gifts now refer not just to the plunder and tribute of the nations, received and distributed, they refer ultimately to the spiritual gifts Christ gives to his disciples, the result of his plundering of Satan's usurped authority and of the spiritual riches of his ascended glory. Really beautiful way to put it. I really enjoyed that. Okay, verse 9. He goes on to explain a little bit about this. He kind of, it seems that St. Paul got excited and wanted to offer this further explanation of this. He says, in saying he ascended, what does it mean but that he had also descended into the lower parts of the earth? He who descended is also he who ascended far above all the heavens, that he might fill all things. And so he's mentioning that this, if you're going to say that God ascended, the only explanation is that he must have descended in some way. And so St. Paul is saying this is just yet another proof of the incarnation of Christ. God descended, became man. And not only that, he actually descended to the lower parts of the earth. So he descended all the way into Hades. So St. Paul gets a little excited here and says, this is yet another proof on our side. This shows this is the fulfillment of what we've been waiting for. Okay, verse 11. And his gifts were that some should be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and to the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Got a whole lot to talk about here. Again, we're going to have to rush through the second half because this is so packed full of good information and spiritual gems for us to really take from. This is like finding the treasure chest. And there's so many pieces of gold we don't know which one to focus on. So this list he gives, apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, it's not an exhaustive list. He's providing the more prominent gifts within the church. Gifts are given in order that we build up the body of Christ. You notice gifts are not just given in the church; they're given so that we can continue to build up the church. So what does this imply? The church's greatest job is to be and to further become the very church that it is. Are there Orthodox churches that are not really churches in their fullness? Yes. We just talked about this at the very beginning. There are churches in which being a member is enough, and you just sit there. In fact, I did an interview, and thank God, I think protected me from this. The first interview I did after seminary to join a parish, there was a retired priest at that parish who largely kind of ran things from the background. And he sat me down while I was there. We had lunch, and he said, if you end up here, you're going to preach. And when you preach, this is not a classroom. Don't sit there and teach the people. They've had long weeks, they're tired. Don't admonish them. You're not a strict principal. You're not telling them what to do. He said, they've had long weeks, they're tired, they're exhausted. They came here so that you could make them feel good. So you make them feel good, and you build it. And I just went, in my mind, oh God, protect me from, don't let me be here. I could never do that. Because that's not the true church. It's not the example that Christ gave. No saint gave that. We have to make sure that we are constantly becoming the church, which means we're being perfected in virtue. We're going to talk about what that means in just a second. That actually, it's the next thing on here. So what does this mean? Well, if the church is a hospital for the sickness of sin, what do you find in the hospital? You find healthy people. Those are the workers. You find the administrators, you find the doctors and the nurses, but then you find sick people. And really, we can find ourselves in these cases, in these categories. Some of us are more healthy members. Some of us are less healthy members. Some of us are very, very sick members who are on our deathbeds, not physically, but spiritually. We're floundering spiritually. And so the church is full of this. It has healthy and unhealthy members and everything in between. Different levels of health and different levels of a lack of illness. So the purpose of the church, when we first enter the church, a lot of people are surprised that baptism doesn't just take away every single one of our passions and temptations. Of course not. Christ was baptized, and the first thing he did was go into the desert to be tempted by the devil. So when we enter the church, we enter as members who need to become fuller and more and healthier members of the church. And so this is what we do in the church, is we're constantly becoming the church more and more. This is the main job of the church. The church's job is to become the church. You can look at that individually. The fathers say that we aren't really people. We're not a person. I'm an individual and I'm a human being, but I'm not a person. Because a person is not just body and soul. That describes a human being. A person is body, soul, and grace. Until we have grace, we're not truly people. We're just really intelligent animals. We act in beastly manners. The desires of the flesh really drive everything that we do. So how do we get out of that? By obtaining grace. That's how we become true persons. We're people trying to become persons. And the church is trying to become the church. And this is done in the 3 stages of the spiritual life. Metropolitan Hierotheos Vlachos talks quite a bit about this. You look in the fathers, and they find in the scriptures in places you would never expect, they describe how these 3 stages of the spiritual life are there. So what are the 3 stages? The first stage is purification, where we are actively seeking to overcome the sin within us. We're seeking to stop sinning, essentially. Then there's illumination, when we're enlightened by the grace of the Holy Spirit. And this is where some people reach the stage of ceaseless prayer and praying the Jesus prayer. And then there's deification, or I like the term glorification, where that state of illumination becomes permanent. These are the stages that we kind of want to rise through. All the people behind me, are the glorified. Some of them reached just illumination in this lifetime. Many of them reached deification or glorification. That's what we're moving towards. But most of us, the vast majority of Christians, are in the stage of purification. And we're seeking to move forward in that stage. This is what the church does for us. This is the place in which we do that, because it gives us the tools to do that. So this is what I meant when I started off by saying we need to become ecclesial beings or ecclesial persons. It's somebody who has entered through those stages and is constantly ascending towards God, and God dwells inside of them. These are true persons. These are ecclesial beings. These are the ones we want to follow after, these saints. He mentions that we want to attain to the true knowledge of the Son of God. And this means, again, when you've heard me say this again and again, true knowledge is revealed to us. You can look through these verses. Does Christ at all seem like he's talking about studying, intellectual study and philosophy? No, he's talking about Christian living. And he's saying that's what leads us to the true knowledge of the Son of God. In order to understand God, we have to become like God. And if we become like God, God will reveal himself to us. He also uses this interesting phrase, to the mature manhood. Mature manhood. Why use this phrase? Again, there's an idea of growing, of maturing, and being strong and courageous in that spiritual fight, and not remaining spiritual infants. You notice in the scriptures, being an infant is seen as both a good and a bad thing, depending on how we look at it. This is why we have to be cautious about how we interpret scriptures. Christ himself says that we need to become like little children. And if we don't, we'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. We really have to become like children. But he's talking about it in a very specific sense. Children are simple. They're simple and they're extremely trusting. Sometimes I joke with my kids. I'll say something that's clearly kind of silly, and just to get a little laugh out of them. It's like if you've ever read Calvin and Hobbes, there's a great one where Calvin's dad explains to Calvin that television is a box with a bunch of little people in it, and you watch the little people perform these different shows and everything. And Calvin becomes convinced of that. When we're children, we're very trusting of our parents. And so every now and then I joke with my kids and they go, really? I'm like, no, not really. What are you talking about? That I have geckos. Some of the geckos laid eggs, and I'll say, but you got to be careful because sometimes those eggs, they don't hatch geckos, they hatch flamingos. Really? There's a beautiful simplicity about that, even though I'm clearly joking. We need to have that simplicity with God. Doesn't mean don't invest. I don't want to take that too far. Don't worry. I'm not saying that we have a blind faith in it. What I'm saying is we learn to have a proper relationship with God, and we trust him. We trust him fully, and we trust him with everything in our lives. At the same time, we can't be immature. We can be spiritually simple, but we can't be immature. We can be spiritually humble. Kids, they don't hold on to things. They can get upset with you, and literally 2 minutes later, they're hugging you and they want to spend time with you, and they've completely forgotten it. That's how we want to be like children. But we don't want to be spiritually immature. We want to make sure that we're actually growing in the faith and putting aside childish things like St. Paul talks about. So there's a dual aspect here. And then he says, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. So to become fully human, to become persons, we have to attain the person. The person. Christ is the man. He is the person. He's the model after which we model our lives. Some of the fathers talk about the sense that when man was created in the image and likeness of God, it also means that we were created after the image of the incarnate God. So the model for what it means to be a man, both physically and spiritually, was Christ. Now you could say, well, Christ wasn't incarnate yet. Yeah, but God is outside of time, and he knew exactly what was going to happen. And so he first created the model of Christ as the man, and then created mankind to attain to that standard. And that's what it means to be a Christian. Be perfect even as my Father in heaven is perfect. It's a high calling. It's a high calling. But it's a calling to which we have to move. And we have to move towards it at least. Okay, verse 14. So that we may no longer be children, tossed to and fro, and carried about with every wind of doctrine, by the cunning of men, by their craftiness in deceitful wiles. It's incredible. Wow. It's such an incredible description. I mean, I can tell you, I'm sure you've seen as well, so many people who are tossed to and fro. There's no peace in the spiritual life. Why? Because there's no spiritual maturity. So if we find, okay, Bob asked a question. I'll get to that in just a second. If we find that we are being tossed to and fro, that we're moving from joy to depression, anger, and all over the place, if we find that there's no stability in our spiritual life, it means that there's a spiritual maturity we haven't found. It doesn't mean everybody else around us is wrong. That's how a lot of people have reacted to this coronavirus thing. Well, the church is wrong, and the bishops are wrong, and the priests are wrong, and everyone's wrong, and now I'm just angry. Well, Or you can say, well, I disagree with these decisions, but I can still maintain my spiritual peace because I'm going to still seek after Christ. And this is the spiritual peace we want. So we have to look for our own spiritual immaturity. So Kevin suggested that maybe we just do half the chapter and continue next week, because we don't want to rush too fast. At first I thought I was going to make it, but I don't know if I'm going to make it. So I think we're going to do just a couple more verses, then I'm going to answer Bob's question, and we'll see what time it is. So verse 15, rather speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by every joint with which it is supplied, when each part is working properly, makes bodily growth and upbuilds itself in love. Interesting. The body has to work properly in order for us to be built up. In order for us to really become the church, we have to be working properly. Once the church starts working improperly, like that parish I told you about, where I was supposed to make everybody feel good with homilies, I wasn't going to do that. It's not the model that we follow. Then the whole progress is broken, and we stop building ourselves up, and we remain stagnant. A lot of parishes are like this, where they just remain at a standstill. You know, I heard of a priest once who, for every gospel, you know, we repeat the gospel lessons every year, and for every gospel he had 3 homilies, and he kept them in a file, and he'd just go on a rotation every 3 years, and after the end of 3 years he'd go back and start again. Well, wait a minute, are you ever addressing the actual issues that are in the community at that time? Is there any sense of growth and of moving forward? Is there any sense of, I mean, first of all, before we even say any of that, for one gospel, you could come up with 100 different homilies, or you should be able to, because the depth of scripture is that great. So why limit ourselves? But it also shows that there is a lack of a sense of progress in the spiritual life, and of addressing specific issues. My last parish, sometimes people would be shocked when I would address very specific issues in the parish. They get almost offended. They say, well, what's the job of the priest? You know, do you go to the doctor and expect him to give you general advice on illness and health every time, or do you expect him to actually address the issues that you're dealing with? This is what a good priest does. Does that mean that some feathers will be ruffled? Of course it does. Of course it does. I told a good priest friend of mine yesterday, he's had a lot of people just attacking him left and right on social media for really ridiculous things. He's just saying what the church believes. People are getting mad. And I told him, we were messaging yesterday, I said, boy, it's been a long time since someone's gotten really mad at me on Facebook. I must not be doing my job. I've been staying away from social media. But I told Father Justin, I said, I'm kind of sick of some of this stuff. I said, I think I'm going to post some of these things on Facebook. He goes, go for it. so yesterday I posted some things and no one got mad at me. So I was a little bit depressed. I told my mom last night, I was on the phone with her. I said, I tried really hard to make some people mad. Jessica, the goal wasn't to make people mad, of course. The goal is to uplift, but that's going to make some people angry. If you're a priest, if you're a Christian, and some people aren't getting annoyed and angry at your life and your preaching, there's something wrong. We need to be bold in what we do. So you notice here, this is going back to Kevin's point. This is also where we begin to see that if everything is joined and knit together, and each part is working properly, then everything works in unison. So there's everything we do, our whole body works in unison. We don't really think about it. You don't have to think when you walk about each individual foot, each individual knee, the legs, how the arms. You just do it. It just works in a beautiful unity. You do it without even thinking. There's a beautiful piece about that, because we don't have to put too much thought into it. But what happens if only one thing is hurt? Now, I had something happen. I went to one of the kids in our parish had a big party at I forget what some classic fun center or something like that. It's got these huge structures that the kids can play on. They can jump off into this big foam pit, and adults can do it too. I was told to jump into the foam pit because, you know, the heavier you are, the less you can move in foam. I almost couldn't get out of there. It was really tough. And when I finally got out, you basically get to the edge and you have to just fall over. And when I did, I jammed my thumb really badly. In fact, it hurt for over a month. But the first week, I had to change the way I did almost everything, because that one hand wasn't functioning properly. It's amazing. When we lose just one member of our body and we lose its full function, everything else has to make up for it. And we see this within a church. When you have a member leave who is really involved in doing something, other members then have to take over. This is one of the dangers, actually, when we have a lot of people we have a lot of people in our parish who are very, very active. Some people become very, very used to that. We're going to talk about that in a second. But one of the comparisons I have here is if you've ever had a major death in your family, major, I mean every death is major, but if you've had somebody who's really united with everybody die, what happens? Well, in a family, you look at it like a web. Every person has a connection. There's a line to each other, every other person, but also they have connecting lines that go through. So like my relationship, for instance, with my mom is direct, but I also had a relationship to her through my dad. So what happened when my dad died? When my dad passed away, that point of connection was lost. And so you have to start redoing, just like with a spider, when there's a hole in the web, if it like catches a bug and then it wraps that bug up and it starts to ruin the web, it has to reweave the web in new ways with the existing structure. This is what happens when a family member dies. Everybody has to find out their new role. My role with my mother, my relationship with her changed when my father died. Same with my sisters, same with everybody in the family. Everything begins to evolve and change because you have to make up for that big major change in that structure. It's true in parishes as well. When you gain a member or lose a member, things have to begin restructuring a little bit. But again, if we all have the common purpose and the common goal, we have a unity within that, and that becomes much simpler. It becomes easier and a more positive experience. If we don't have that unity and we're doing things pridefully and with egoism, suddenly it starts to break. And I've seen plenty of parishioners in every parish I've been a part of leave because things didn't work the way they thought they should and the way they expected. And they get really upset and ruffled about different things. So what does this mean for us? Well, if the church works best if we all have the same unity, but we also have different gifts, because again, equality doesn't mean sameness. We have different gifts and we apply those gifts in different ways. You have to be cautious when some people end up taking the load of the work. And I'll tell you right now, in our parish, this is a problem sometimes. I see the same people staying on Sundays cleaning. I see the same people taking care of issues. I see the same people, when they see garbage outside of the church, picking it up. The same people are putting in a lot of work. And so a lot of other people get really used to that. And they come and they want to take the spiritual gifts of the parish without actually contributing to the parish. We have to be cautious about that, because what does that mean? It means spiritually, we're leeches. We're leeches. We suck the life out of the church, but we don't offer anything in return. You have to be extremely cautious about that. That's being a broken member of the church. When my hand wasn't working too well, when I really jammed my thumb hard, suddenly this hand wasn't really contributing much. I couldn't do much. I couldn't even pick things up for a couple of days because it hurt that bad. Everything else had to make up for it. Can you imagine if I just got used to that and said, I've gotten used to this. I'm never going to use this hand again. That's kind of how we can become in the spiritual life. And that's why we want to make sure that we're contributing members and we're being selfless and giving of ourselves. Is everybody going to give themselves in the same way? No, of course not. A simple example of that, people are coming to me and they say, Father, I'd really like to join the choir. I say, okay, let's do the test. Do this. If you can't do that, I really appreciate your fervor. This isn't your gift. This isn't what you're set for, but there's always something that can be done. Of course, our parish has plenty that we need to work on a lot of different areas. We see this a lot with the children. We have a lot of kids in our parish. It's great in our parish. Families and parents don't mind if other people kind of correct their children. So it's a beautiful thing. There's a lot of humility there with parents, because some parents get really protective about that. Ideally, we want the parents to be aware of their own children. We don't want them to run wild, but you do see that kind of unity in those areas where it's really needed. But we need to make sure that we're all contributing in that sense. We should all be part of the cleaning crews, the food crews, whichever we can do. And we should have one or two things that we're really dedicated to the church with. And I'll tell you, having said that, not everyone does that. We also have a lot of people who do, and they do an incredible job of it. And I'm not going to single anybody out and raise up their egos, but there are a lot of people who in hidden ways, this is why we have to be careful not to judge, in ways that only Father Justin and I see, have really contributed. And not just monetarily. I'm not just talking about that. In other ways, people do things, but they like to remain quiet and humble about it. It's a really, in fact, I would say that's the majority of our parish. But every now and then we can fall into that leech mode. We have to be very cautious. So we will stop there. I'm going to answer Bob's question really quick, because I still have about a page and a half worth of notes. it's like I said, it's such a packed chapter, and I do want to read next week. I'll read Archbishop Verke's summary because he's got about 2 pages of a summary because there's so much there. So Bob asked this question. He says the 3 stages of purification, illumination, glorification. He says they're not linear in the respect that while working on purification, we also are incrementally illumined, and however microscopically we attain some measure of theosis or deification or glorification. Um, this is what I'd say. They're not linear in the sense that the fathers talk about how we can move both up in those and back. So a state of glorification might last for an hour or a week. We've seen this with some saints who are just in that spiritual state for a while, and then they move back to illumination. We've also seen some who were illumined, but then through a sin fell back into purification and then had to build themselves up. So it's true. It's not that you're just stuck in one stage and then you move to the next and suddenly you're there until you move to the next. You can actually shift in between them. But the sense that I'd be careful about saying that the sense that while we're being purified, we're also being illumined. Well, the thing is that illumination isn't really effective in us. It's not active and energized, I guess we could say, until purification is complete. And so you're not going to find somebody who is still deeply struggling with sin who also has achieved unceasing prayer. And if they have, there's probably a little bit of delusion here. There's a stage at which we want to look at it and say, okay, well, what's going on here? How is it that the grace of God is illuminating you while you're also actively working against God through sin? Because that's what sin is, to turn away from God. How can you turn away from God and towards God at the same time? It doesn't really work. It doesn't really work. So even in purification, we're constantly going back and forth in that. Hopefully, while we make one step back, we're also making 3 steps forward. We're making some sort of progress. And you've heard me talk about this, that the lines of righteousness and unrighteousness, they run parallel one another. So it's not that we're either in righteousness or in unrighteousness, and that's just all there is to it. If that were true, every time we sin, all of our progress would be gone, and we just have to restart every time, and we'd just be bereft of every grace. But grace also helps us repent. And so really the way to look at it is there's 2 parallel lines, but if our unrighteous line is this thick and our righteousness line is this thick, they're this thin, we want to work on growing the righteous line. And if you do that, then the unrighteous line will start to shrink on its own. That's St. Porphyrios' approach. Work on it, on growing in grace and working towards illumination, and the unrighteousness, the sin in you will eventually shrivel up and die on its own. Then once that happens, then illumination occurs. So you're working towards illumination, but we wouldn't say that you're working in illumination and purification at the same time. Does that make sense? Bob says yes, and I can't see everybody at the same time. Oh, actually, most of you are not doing video, so it doesn't really help if I ask it in that way. But hopefully that makes sense. Gigi, I'm guessing that's Carrie, says the 3 ages of the interior life. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, so I'd have to look at it. But yeah, if it's based in the patristic text. By the way, these three stages of the spiritual life, this is not some modern interpretation of orthodoxy. This is found throughout the fathers. St. Maximus the Confessor talks a lot about it. In fact, he says that the three categories of clergy, deacon, priest, and bishop, this is really the model of how the clergy should be. The deacons are the ones who have actively worked on being purified and are essentially in a state of purification of some sort. The priest should have reached illumination. The bishop should be the deified, the glorified. Of course, that's an ideal. It's not what we're all working towards. He also talks about how you see this in the architecture of the church, the narthex, that entryway into the church. How do we enter the fullness? Like I said, where the church becoming the church. That's purification. And then you have the nave where we stand and worship. That's illumination, and then glorification is within the altar. So even the structure of the church shows us these stages. But the fathers talk. St. Maximus Confessor isn't the only one. If you read the Philokalia, you see these 3 stages talked about quite a bit. Many saints talk about them, and some of them, they use different terms depending on the time they lived and kind of where they were and the language that they were using. But you find them, and the fathers, like I said, will find these 3 stages in the scriptures in places you would never expect. You can read the scriptures 100 times over and not see it, but because they're illumined by the grace of God, they can see things more clearly, and they'll explain where these 3 stages are in some of the parables and some of the words of Christ and some of the epistles, and it's pretty awesome. So if you want to learn about this more, I would really suggest reading books by Metropolitan Hierotheos Vlachos, and the main one I'd recommend reading is a little book. It's pretty short. It's called Orthodox Spirituality. I think it's called A Brief Introduction is the subtitle. But it can be tough to find. His books usually are. They're all shipped from Greece, so they tend to be expensive. It's worthwhile, though. I have a copy of it at church. I may have a second copy here. And I may have a finished scan of it. I don't think I have finished it, but this is a little under the table, although this is going on YouTube for everybody, but just keep this between us if you're watching. If you want a copy of it digitally, just let me know, and I'll try to complete that scan hopefully in the next week, and you can read it if you want. But it's an awesome book, really, really good. Some people find it tough and confusing, but it's worth pushing through. It's definitely worth pushing through, and it's not too tough. It here means simple in some ways, in most ways, but it's well worth your time. So, any other questions before we end for today? If you want a digital copy of it, by the way, just email me. If you message me here, a couple people already have. They messaged me. I will forget.
I have a question.
Yes. Heidi.
Did you say something at the beginning about whether or not there was any news about going back to church?
No. Before we started recording, I was going to mention that, but because we hadn't received anything, I didn't mention anything. I can check really quickly while you're on here, and just check my email and see if anything has changed. But so far, we haven't received the letter. And of course, if we have, I'm not going to sit here and read it in front of everybody because that will be terribly boring. But so far, I have not received any email at all from the Archdiocese. So we're hoping that letter comes out today. It's not guaranteed, by the way. It's not guaranteed it'll come out today. We were told that hopefully it will come out. The bishops did meet yesterday, though. So we'll let you know as soon as we can. Anything else? Come on, I can't stand hearing the sound of my voice only. This is very odd not doing it in person. When we do it in person, we get off on weird tangents all over the place because everyone's talking, and it's more engaging in that sense. So please, any other questions? This has been a big adjustment for me, by the way. Hearing my own voice and not being able to see and hear people's reactions. I've gotten a little bit more used to it in the past weeks. But all right, 5 seconds to ask questions or make comments for.
I have a question.
Yay.
When you're able to go back to church and meet together in this Bible study, will you continue to record so those of us who are on the fringes?
Yes. We on the fringes of society. that's all.
From the diaspora.
You're in exile. Yes, that's a few people have emailed me that question. The plan is from now on we will record the Bible studies. I don't know if they will be recorded through video or just through audio. There's a good chance it may just be audio. And again, we're gonna try that at first, but because we do go off on so many tangents, that may not be the most beneficial thing. So maybe we'll just live stream it, but not record. I don't know yet. But right now the plan is at least to try recording them. And of course, we do a men's and women's Bible study separately. I think that the men tend to go on less tangents. The ladies, she'll be fine with me saying that's Katie's fault. Well, and my fault, because Katie and I tend to go off on tangents. Katie,
I would like to go off on tangents.
Yeah. So, well, we do a lot. We get into kind of interesting topics, but so probably what I'll do is I'll record the men's a few times, and if that works well, we'll keep doing it. But the plan is to keep doing that. I think this situation has caused Father Justin and myself to kind of examine more closely how we're doing a lot of things. We want to do higher quality videos, and I think we want to keep doing videos even after the church opens. At least one or two a week, and just so we can keep posting this. Because I have people who are not part of our parish who have watched some of the videos and said they really benefited from them. So there's a few things we'll do differently, and that's one of them. Is the hope is to long answer, yes.
Okay, thank you.
The hope is to do that.
Father?
Yes.
If it's possible, is there any way I can get in on the men's meetings?
Well, that's that's the plan. Is I think I don't know if we're just going to record them or if we're going to live stream and record. We're trying to figure that out and see what kind of is best to do.
I think what I'm asking is I haven't been a part of those. If you could approve me to be in on that.
Well, so right now, this is the only study right now. I'm talking about when the church is open. What we do is
okay.
Tuesday mornings we do liturgy, and then we do a men's Bible study and women's Bible study. And
Yeah.
we try to remain even with those, but that doesn't always happen. Which is again
Okay.
one of the reasons that I'll have to just kind of choose one to record.
You got my email, right?
I do.
Okay, good.
If you get the parish emails, so those will be, if we do that in the recorded, they'll be emailed every week.
Hey, can I get you my new phone number right quick?
Well, why don't you private message it to me? Because this is going to go up on YouTube. I don't know if you want to give it to everybody.
Let me see if I can figure out how to do that.
And if not, just email me.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else?
That baby is so cute.
Wait, my baby?
No, this little baby. Sophie. Sophie.
Oh.
Hey.
Okay, hang on a minute, Father. Don't disconnect. Let me send that to you.
Oh, I
Father
wasn't seeing
Justin,
that.
your little baby,
I
sorry,
wasn't-
Father Paul,
oh,
your little baby's very cute too.
I had myself pinned, so I didn't see that that Steve was lifting up his baby. So I was very confused because I thought, how are you seeing my baby? Because he's not here. So yes, the Oneidas have produced a very beautiful little girl.
Thanks.
Did you get that?
Hold on, I just changed my screen. So anybody watching YouTube right now can probably leave. Did you email it to me or text me?
I just sent it to you on private messenger. I don't know.
Okay, I don't see it right now, but I'll check. You sent it through Zoom?
Yeah. I don't know why.
Yeah, I don't actually see it here.
Huh. Well,
Like I said, email it to me. That's probably the best way to go. Is just email it to me. So okay, any other questions about Ephesians before we finish up? Again, 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Okay, I really hope that that you're all enjoying this and feel like you're benefiting from it. I have to tell you, just studying it has been awesome for me. It's been really incredible. Like I said, chapter 4 is just, oh my gosh, there's so much. Oh, Ron, it just came through. There have been a lot of things that I haven't talked about because it's just so packed. I mean, we could spend days and days and days just doing this one chapter, and like all the other chapters. So I hope you're enjoying it. Next week, we will do the second half of chapter 4. If we don't do it in person, because I don't know if we'll be back at church, but we'll at least do it on this. And then we'll start getting into chapter 5. So we'll be on Ephesians for about 3-4 more weeks. And then we'll figure out what to do next. So God bless you all. Christ is risen. Christos anesti. Christus ist auferstanden.
Truly he is risen.
Waarlijk is auferstanden.
Nice.
Thank you, Father. See you later.
Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. Risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. God bless you all. Again, Christos anesti. Good to see you all.
Christos anesti.
Christos anesti.